like to make a few introductions. To my far right is our regular member, Peter Berry. To his left is our regular member, Judy Burgess. Myself, I'm Carrie Ashburn. To my left is our regular member and vice chair, Paul Bover. And to his left is Ron Morell, also a regular member. And to his left is our town's attorney, Alan Shepherd. And with that, we will get down to business. We have up first a public hearing for Berwick Iron and Metal Recycling, a reconsideration of previously submitted conditional use permit. This is located at 106 Route 236, map R57, lot 32. It's a metal shredder proposal. We are looking at a sound assessment, results of that, as well as results of an air quality peer analysis that was conducted on this property. The way the public hearing works is the applicant will make a brief summary of what's going on and the project up to date with the plan to show and update everybody in the audience, as well as the board. The board will then ask questions to the applicant. When they are exhausted of their questions, I will then open the public hearing up to the public. If you would like to make a statement, comment, question, what have you, please just signify by raising your hand. Please come up to the podium where we have so many people here tonight and state your name and your address just for the record as well, if you wouldn't mind. Any questions, comments, or anything relating thereof, please address to the chair. I'll then have the specific person that needs to answer, or if I can answer, will answer at that time for you. Okay, so going forward, who is representing tonight for Berwick Iron and Metal? Mr. Hartman, is that you?
It is me. Hi, I'm gonna put some plans on this.
Fine. Be careful pushing that back. It's loose.
I'm Tom Harmon from Civil Consultants in South Berwick. I'm here this evening representing Berwick Iron and Metal, particularly Rick and Rob Brenner, who are here this evening. Also with me is the project engineer from our office, Jay Stevens. Mike Peverett has done the survey work on the project. He's here in the audience someplace. Along with that, we've got Matt Manahan and Dixon Pike from Pierce Atwood. Jeff Harrington is an air specialist from AMEC. Rob O'Neill is here from Epsilon. Okay, they will all be answering questions. The air people, I believe, and the noise people will be making brief presentations. My purpose right at this time is to do a brief overview of the project. Okay, where we've been. We actually started this project, I think, in February of 2010. Came back again with a full application September of that year. We had approval from the planning board in March of this year. That was appealed by abutters, went to court, and the court sent it back to the planning board for further consideration. There are a couple particular items that they're interested in. One was the air. The other thing was the procedure with the planning board. And so we are now back before you again. We've been back to the planning board, I believe, once before this round. We have gone out and done a site visit at the site. And we have site visit, and we've also, it wasn't public, but we also have run noise tests, okay, on the equipment with it operating. That is on the agenda tonight to find out the results of that test, okay? So basically what we're talking about is Rick and Rob purchased a scrap metal yard from Jimmy Doucette in 2005. In 1995, Jim had that license with the town and ran it for approximately 10 years. These fellows have been here for about 5 or 6 years running a scrap yard, which, if we take a look, this is a Google photograph, a GIS photograph. 236, here's your transfer station in town, Powerhouse Road. This is a sewage treatment plant. Their operation The scrapyard is right here. They're proposing to add a shredder. The shredder is in place. They're proposing to operate it basically in the area you see on the photograph that is shown as the right here. So what it is an expansion of their scrapyard. And what it's going to do is it's going to add a metal shredder to it, that they're going to be able to further process the material in that yard prior to selling. As part of that operation, because they are putting a shredder in, we also need to get a DEP waste processing license. That application is in with the state, the Department of Environmental Protection. We have had a public meeting on that. That was noticed, and I don't remember exactly when it was. I'd tell you, probably 10 months ago we did that. And that process is in the middle at DEP. We're waiting for a permit for that. So basically, here's a photograph of it. Then what we have, these are the plans that were approved by the planning board in March. Essentially, what we've done is shown where the improvements are. This was the existing facility. These buildings, what we proposed to do, we paved the driveway, paving down in this area, which will be taking the processed material. The scrap will be fed to a shredder. This indicates the shredder, a building that houses the drive for that, the locomotive engine, the conveyors, where the scrap is going to be processed, where it's going to be stockpiled, and the surrounding features. As we came through this process, we found that the property that the Brenners purchased was a non-conforming lot. When they purchased it, the lot was non-conforming. So as we came through the approval process, there were land transfers between Pepin, who had purchased from Doucette and runs the concrete batch plant, and the Brenners, so that they picked up some land here from Pepin to make this lot conforming. It had nothing to do with the operation. It didn't change how the processing worked, how the scrapyard worked. What it did is it simply made this lot conforming. So what we have here is we have a metal shredder that will take metal. It's rated at 100 tons an hour. It is driven by a locomotive engine that has been redone, okay, completely rebuilt. It's a 1960-something locomotive engine, 3,600 horsepower. It has a DEP air emission license for it. Like I say, we have to have a DEP waste processing license. We also have an entrance permit from the state where we changed the entrance here. The entrance used to be a gravel driveway. We paved it, made the entrance wider to facilitate vehicles entering and leaving. That did require us to get a permit from the state because we were working in there right away. And there's also a multi-sector general permit that this project runs over. It ran under that permit when the Brenners purchased it in 2005. They actually didn't even realize, I don't think at the time, Rob may argue with me, but I don't believe they even realized they had that permit. DEP came down, talked to them, facilitated the permit for them, and they had been operating under that permit, and I simply purchased the property. Particulars of the project. This now has a stormwater treatment system that has been installed. It was designed to fit this processing yard. That stormwater treatment system has been installed. It treats the majority of the property that was in place, the operation that was in place, and it also has an extensive treatment system that will work on the stormwater and the new processing area. The one section of the yard that isn't treated goes from here back out to 236. That is something that was not treated when they started, and we have a small portion here that is not. That is acceptable under the current stormwater laws. The property is serviced by both wells and by public water. They will not be hitched up to the public water. The public water is sitting here with a fire hydrant, which they extended about 800 feet from Powerhouse Road. The purpose of that was to have fire protection. septic system on the site is here. It has been there since the 80s. It was put in, I believe, for a home on the site. It is large enough to take care of the 20 people that will be working here. There currently are 15. They'll be hiring another 5 people when this operation begins. That septic system will handle that. Same thing with the water on the site. The existing wells will take care of their domestic needs. Power for the property. There is existing power. There was existing power coming into the scrapyard that came up this driveway. Since that time, they have found that this was not going to be enough to power the operation they needed at the shredder and the conveyor facilities around that. So they have brought a new line in through this property. There's a new power line coming in. That power line powers the conveyor, powers rollers in the shredder, that type of thing. It runs the auxiliary operations for the processing. The locomotive engine simply drives the shredder. They have an easement from the Pepins. After talking to the fire department was interested in having secondary access to the property. There is an easement across Pepin's property. There is a gate here, which is secondary access for the fire department, should that be needed. Don't see it behind me.
There's about 5 chairs here. You guys can laugh.
They said stormwater, that has been constructed, it's set on the site. Some of the things we're doing, we are requesting a waiver from the regulations for waste processing. There are certain setbacks that are required. Because this was an existing site without those necessary licenses, we do need to have some waivers for separation to the residences up here, to the wells on Pepin's property, on the Chandler property. Those are at the DEP, will be part of that license. We're asking for those waivers. Basically, that's where we are with this plan. Sure, when I'm done, I can ask my cohorts and they'll tell me if I missed something. We have in the,
Tom, can you speak up a little louder, please? I'm having trouble hearing you in the back.
okay, I thought I spoke quite loud, but yeah, just call, raise your hand. Okay. At the site visit, we took a number of people around, and out of that site visit, there were comments about there were things on this site that were not part of the approval. What we've done is the process, we had the approval, like I said, from the planning board back in March. We have not submitted new plans to the planning board. I brought in a set tonight. There were things on those plans, the new plans that weren't on the plans in March. Those were not things that we felt were germane to the planning board's approval. Particularly, Rob has added a new sorter on the conveyors. That is part of the process. We don't believe that that part of the process required a building permit or a permit from the planning board. It's simply part of the conveyors, and it's part of the process that was there. In addition, Rob added some firefighting protection. He actually put a tank, a water tank out there, and he put some fire guns on his machine builder, on his motor building, that he could aim at any spot in the yard if there ever was a problem. All right? Those are indicated on a new plan that's been updated within the last couple of weeks. We have provided copies of those tonight to the planning board. I believe people that were at the site visit might have seen these plans, or they also saw the features out there. So these updated plans have been provided to the planning board tonight. But as I say, we don't think that there's anything particularly on there that was outside what our approval was in March. Okay, that firefighting, I don't believe it requires building permits. Okay, they're gonna fall over again. Okay. Essentially, I believe that's basically where we are with the project. We're here tonight, unless my people want me to touch on something else on the site, anything I missed, Rob, Matt? Okay, what we'd do is I would ask Rob O'Neill, who's the sound fellow, as part of the agenda tonight, to talk about the sound test, which we had several weeks ago, and have him come up and make a presentation on the result of that sound test. I might say that we have had studies done prior to submitting our application of what we anticipated for sound for the project. We can quickly run through those and then where we turned out the other day on the actual live test.
Thanks, Tom. My name is Robert O'Neill from Epsilon Associates. Can folks hear me in the back of the room?
No, good job.
All right. Rob O'Neill from Epsilon Associates. I apologize to folks in the front of the room if I have to holler. Our firm was hired by Berwick Iron and Metal to do the noise testing, the sound testing for this facility. A year and a half ago, we came on board to study the site, do some calculations and some estimations what the sound levels would be from the shredder once it was in place. That report was prepared and submitted to the board last year. Since that time, there's been some discussions and a request to actually test the shredder. Let's see what it sounds like. So folks asked for that. So on Tuesday, November 1st, there was what we call a live test, a live shredder test out at the site. And the results of that are contained in a brief letter report dated November 10th, 2011, a copy of which have been provided to the planning board, public document. And I'm going to try to summarize that here briefly tonight for folks. Just use one of these maps and get an arrow photo. This is the kind of thing that's not going to, it's going to be very hard for folks in the entire room to see, so I'm just going to have to basically talk about it. But at the site, Tom's already given you an overview. We tested at 4 locations around the site. On the western property line over by Powerhouse Road, the southern property line here directly across from the shredder in the woods, at the eastern property line near the Duffy residence, and then again at the northern property line. So 4 testing locations. The town ordinance requires compliance at the property line. So we tested in those 4 different directions. The test was run from about 10 o'clock in the morning to 11 o'clock in the morning. We did a full 1 hour of testing, and Berwick Iron and Metal fed in a collection of cars and whatever metal, scrap metal they had over there. I don't know how many cars, it was a lot of cars, and we fed it continuously for that full hour. This is the part where it's going to get a little tricky because these graphs can be kind of hard to see. So what I'm going to have to do is just basically talk about it. But what we've got is we have sound level data that were measured at those locations and for the entire 60-minute period. This graph, which is figure 2 in the report that Epsilon prepared, has a summary graph for each of the 4 locations. Again, I apologize, folks aren't going to be able to see this, but the point of this graph is it shows you on a minute-by-minute basis for the 60 minutes, each of the data points at the 4 locations. And it's very clear from these points that all the sound levels were well below 75 decibels. Now, the facility is in the industrial commercial district in town, and according to the town of Berwick, noise per performance standards, the sound level limits for that district are 75 decibels. So that's the number that we use to compare the results to that. Again, 75 decibels at the top of this graph, and the lines down here, these 4 lines represent the 4 locations that we tested. The point of this is that the sound levels were well below the 75 decibels throughout the course of the test. In addition to that test, we did a 20-minute test afterwards without the shredder running, but with the rest of the scrap metal facility in operation. That data is also shown in the report, and those sound levels are equal to or lower than the levels with the shredder running. Also, during the course of our testing, a couple of folks from Tech Environmental were present for the testing, representing some concerned abutters, and 2 of their folks were at 2 of our 4 stations around the perimeter of the site, and I'm sure that they'll want to talk about their results, but the final figure in our sound level report shows that our meters are basically side by side, called dueling meters if you want, and we came up with, as you would expect, very similar numbers and results. With that, I want to try to keep it brief. This stuff gets a little tedious, and just say the conclusion from the testing is that the shredder, while you could certainly hear it, that audibility is not the criterion in town. The town criteria is 75 decibels, and the shredder at all 4 property lines was well below that 75 decibel criteria. With that, I will stop, and you want to take questions now? or-
Wait a minute,
Okay.
let's finish up.
Are you done with your presentation?
Well, do you want to bring up the question on the peer review?
Yep.
Or the- for the end, I was part of it, yeah.
Okay. At this time, I'd like to bring forth, the town asked for a peer analysis. There were 2 air quality tests that were submitted to us from 2 different companies. We wanted our own person to analyze these tests, to come up with a third party, so to speak, interpretation of what the 2 tests meant. Tim Donnelly, hi. Come on up.
Probably should move up front.
You need to project.
That's gonna be a problem. As Carrie said, my name is Tim Donnelly. I'm with the firm McMillan and Donnelly. We've been doing air licensing and permitting for the past 20 years. Just to correct you, the studies we're asked to review are not air quality tests. They're air quality analyses. One was the analysis, and the other was what I would term a rebuttal of the initial submittal. So with that said, and this is somewhat technical, I'm going to go through the highlights, and I've already talked with the applicant who prepared the original air quality analysis, and any question that I've raised, I'd like to direct it to him to answer on the spot, as opposed to raising a bunch of questions, then trying to go back and backtrack and find out exactly what we're talking about, if that suffices. So, Joan Shu asked us to review the studies, the study and the letter submitted by Woodard and Kern. So we went through it, and the first thing we noticed was that the stated objective is to comply with the Town of Berwick Land Use Ordinance, Section 7.1, air quality. And the study chose to do that by demonstrating compliance with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards and the Maine Ambient Air Quality Standards, which, for all intent and purposes, are no longer, they've been repealed this summer. I do want to point out that as you all know, that the Berwick Iron and Metal Recycling was issued an air license by the Maine DEP as a minor source of air pollution. In the state of Maine, that's less than 100 tons per year of one pollutant, or 50 tons for VOC. Not something you all will understand, but it's a minor source of air pollution. Because they are a minor source, they were not required to do an air quality analysis based on the thresholds they were proposing to emit, and it's also a case-by-case study. I checked with the Maine DEP, asked them why not, and they said it just wasn't triggering the threshold. We felt it didn't warrant an air quality analysis. The applicant went ahead and did an air quality analysis. I understand the Maine DEP did do some in-house modeling. The results, that there was a computer crash, and apparently the results were lost in the interim. I didn't realize this has been a year-long project. I just came on board less than 3 weeks ago, I believe. And I am nervous in front of crowds in case you can't figure that out. Well, these are, let's see better. So the objective was to demonstrate that they would meet the land use ordinance 7.1 air quality by demonstrating compliance with the primary and secondary national ambient air quality standards, which were set to protect human health and public welfare. The primary, and our firm concurs with that. I think that's a good objective, given that you don't need to model to get your license. You have an air license, so we're going to go and do this air quality analysis just to answer questions and see what's going on to the nearby residences and it's the community. I mean, it's not just Berwick. As you know, dispersion, it'll get out and travel. So we felt that was a good way to approach it. In the primary national ambient air quality standards are set to protect human health. So we felt that was synonymous with the land ordinance or the land use ordinance where it says injuries to humans. In the secondary national ambient air quality standards were to protect public welfare, and we felt that matched well with the part of section 7.1 that protects animals, vegetation detrimental to enjoyment of adjoining or nearby properties, or which could soil or stain persons or property at any point beyond the lot line of a commercial or industrial establishment creating the emission. So we concurred on the stated objective and why they are doing it. And also 7.1 states any emissions must meet all applicable state and federal statutes. Now, forgive me if we start talking jargon that goes over your heads. Not over your heads, it's just that we talk a lot of acronyms that aren't bandied about by the general public. But there's a thing called the significant impact levels. Those are when you use a dispersion model, which is a complex set of algorithms within a software package, and you have your data input and then you get your data output. And your data output would be your impacts to receptors. They have a level called the significant impact level. If your impacts alone are below that, you're saying that you have an insignificant impact to towards the national ambient air quality standards. You're done. If I was going for a license, you'd be done. So with that said, let me back up. So that's kind of the cutoff. If you're below that, you're done. Now, part of a study, a dispersion, if we were doing this for an air license, and I keep coming back to that because that's what we're doing for. I would say in the 20 years we've been in business, I think 99% of the work we've done for air quality dispersion analyses are for licenses or permits. Outside the state of Maine, they're called permits. Part of that is you do an emissions inventory. We're going to come on site and see what kind of pollutant-creating devices, combustion devices, or activities you have. We're going to try to quantify that using emission factors, good engineering judgment, stack tests from similar operations. So that's the first step. We're going to do an emissions inventory. The AMEC, who was the applicant's contractor to do that, came in, they identified the diesel engine that we talked about. They quantified it by they were going to look at it running 8760, that's every hour of the year at full load. That's standard practice to estimate potential to emit for the entire year. I want to point out the DEP license condition, based on the limited use of fuel, limits them to a total of, it would be 750 hours per year. How they use that fuel is up to them, but they started looking at 8760 hours per year, but the air license says, great, but you can run up to 750 total by fuel use. We're not saying your hours on the clock. There is a question, and I'll direct this to Jeff, about the process source. We did some search on metal shredding. Couldn't find a lot of stack test information. I would ask you, was the manufacturer contacted for any emissions data? Jeff Harrington, excuse me.
Jeff Harrington, I'm from AMEC. I did the air quality analysis that Tim referred to. We did not specifically talk to the manufacturer about air emissions data. We do have a letter from the vendor that expresses with the water sprays in the system that the emissions from the hammer mill, part of the shredder, would be well controlled. And based on that, and based on other similar operations, that I've experienced with, and I've been doing this as long as Tim has. I've been doing this work for almost 25 years now. So based on that and other facilities that I'm familiar with that have similar operations, my conclusion was, in understanding the particulate emissions that would be coming from that shredder, that those would be insignificant.
And I asked that question because we did the same work and concurred with that. We found some permit applications, we found some natural permits in other states, and the water spray and the shroud seemed to be the best available control technology. Thus, most states weren't quantifying what was coming off the shredder. Fugitive emissions were evaluated. Fugitive emissions they could be someone sweeping a parking lot and raising dust, and it travels off property onto your property. That's a fugitive emission. It could be a stockpile of fuel. It could be payloaders driving around the facility. It could be conveyor belts dropping fuel or processed materials on the ground. Anything that creates dust is called a fugitive emission. I know they were evaluated by AMEC and based on professional judgment, which included based on their size, the water spray and shroud, and they concluded off-site impacts would be minimal and would meet section 7.1. We would concur with that, and I'd also point out that the DEP air license includes the standard opacity limits on general process and fugitive emission sources. So the air license that didn't require an air quality analysis has restrictions as how much fugitive emissions you could emit off that property. And if you have any questions, I would suggest you can interrupt me at any time. Part of that, they did a GEP stack height analysis. Basically, you want to make sure your stack's high enough that you're not getting re-entrainment from your building. You know, the eddies from a river, it's the same thing with air. Air goes over a building, creates a wake effect in the cavity region. If your stack is too short, it traps your emissions within the cavity or wake region, drives up the concentration. So you do a good engineering practice stack height analysis. AMEC had done that. They took the building dimensions from the site plan that were transferred to an aerial photograph. They took the roof heights obtained from design drawing of diesel engine building. And Jeff, I'm not trying to put you in a spot, just want to conclude, were the heights of the building field verified?
I did not independently verify
Okay.
those values.
But you've been on site.
Yeah, and they certainly were approximate, and they seemed reasonable to me. And they would have been, I'm going to defer that to Tom. Tom
Those
would
were,
know that.
those were field survey.
Okay.
Okay, by a registered survey if I was sitting here. Okay.
I'm just, as again, it is nitpicking. I'm looking at peer review and say, well, what about this? We would make sure it's field verified. For instance, we've been on a power plant where they told us the boiler house was 115 feet designed, and you go out when it's built and it's 145 feet. Changes things. So that's the question I was asking Jeff. The stack at the facility is greater than the GEP formula height, which concludes there'll be no building wake effects. In plain language, that means the dispersion's better. You're not going to have it being held close by on the property or nearby properties. The emission rates are based on maximum allowable rates. That is standard operating practice. The modeling protocol, it was followed generally accepted methodology one would use for a DEP air application. Again, they weren't required to do this, but it seemed like Jeff followed the protocol as if you're going through the DEP process. Model selection, the receptors, I think you placed over 5,000 receptors in your model. The meteorological data use and the nitrogen dioxide conversion, though we reviewed that, and that methodology is acceptable. It's something that is in pretty much every application that goes to the main DEP. The background air quality data that was conserved as maximum measured concentrations were used may include direct impact from nearby sources. I'll come back to that in a bit. I'll go to the results. The results for sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide, 2 criteria pollutants predicted to be less than the significant impact levels, thresholds. Before I mentioned significant impact levels, they're below that, so that's done. They would not even proceed. They're insignificant. I hesitate to use that term because it's used elsewhere. Now the NO2, the PM10, nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter less than 10 microns, and particulate matter less than 2.5 microns are above the significant impact level, which typically would include obtaining nearby source data for interactive modeling within the radius of impact. And the question asked, was the Maine DEP or New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services contacted for nearby source contributions for NOx or PM10 or PM2.5?
We did not contact either agency for interactive data. So the reason why we didn't do that is based on the distances to known facilities in the area. It's been my experience with the amount of margin that we had in the NACS analysis that you have yet to discuss, that those interactive sources that would be in the general vicinity would not be sufficiently close to have an interactive impact that would be of concern.
Okay. My follow-up question is, I wasn't sure if you didn't do that because you felt the background values were sufficiently conservative to count for nearby source contributions. And I did talk to the Maine DP, and they felt the same thing, that, well, Pratt and Whitney, they're all on gas. There weren't a lot of main sources, but I'm thinking across the river, the power plants may have an impact that could reach this distance.
They could, and again, with that distance involved, I think the impact, when you look at the margin, again, we haven't talked about this yet, but there's a margin between our results and the ambient air quality standard, and those power plants would have to be considerably closer for us to be concerned with that. The other factor that you mentioned is background air concentration. You'll probably talk a little bit more about that too. Background air quality is measured by, in Maine, the DEP, and New Hampshire, the DES. And typically when we do these ambient air quality standards, and we are required when an impact is predicted above the significant impact level to include background air quality in our assessment. So it's added to the maximum predicted impact by our air quality models. That background air quality that we are asked to use by the DEP and the DES in New Hampshire and any agency in the country is a very conservative estimate of background air quality. They very typically will take, for example, for annual standards, they will take the maximum measured background air quality in a region and ask you to use that data combined with your predicted data to demonstrate that your concentrations are going to be less than ambient air quality standards. So when you consider that the background is an extraordinarily conservative number, that frequently it's the maximum or it might be the second high value that's collected over, say, a 24-hour period, it's very likely that that background air data does include air quality impacts from other nearby sources. So that's another factor in the decision.
That's still my follow-ups there. I was going to mention that the background, using conservative background data, typically accounts for nearby contributions. So, again, I didn't look at your range of impact for significant impact levels. So I don't know if there's overlapping. The results of the study, as Jeff alluded to, when added with background, that would be for PM 2.5, PM 10, and NO2. When it added to background, where they had a margin, quite a margin beneath the national ambient air quality standards. And I might want to point out that the majority of the particulate matter that we're adding in, it's 3/4 of the standard, and then the incremental amount that you may add to it is small. If you can have patience, I can point that out. Have I sufficiently lost folks yet?
Oh, it is looking pretty bad in there.
I think we have a significant impact on it.
For instance, I'm driving them out here. For instance, the background for PM 10, the standard is 150 for the 24-hour period. The background air quality, that means just when you walk outside, what you're breathing in is 41 micrograms. The contribution is 6.4 for a total of 47.4, so you're less than 1/3 the national ambient air quality standard for PM 10. PM 2.5, smaller particle size. It's really becoming the pollutant of concern because of inhaling, and we know that Maine has the highest asthma rate in the country. The standard is 34, or 35, and the background is 24. So you're starting off, you only have an 11 microgram window to fit in, and the impact was 6.4, so your impacts are 30.4, well below the 35. And the NO2 standards, the annual standard is 100, the impact plus background was 7. And the 1 hour standard, which is a new standard, 1 hour NO2 standard, very difficult standard. The predicted impact from the diesel was 70, just under 79, the background's 47, for a total of 126, and the standard's 189. So there is quite a margin, from the background plus impacts compared to standard. Feel free, I see people having quizzical looks. If you want to ask that question, please do. And I do want to ask, were reduced load scenarios looked at in the actual operating modes? Because I didn't see that, the write-up, I did not see.
Yeah, we didn't include those in our write-up. We did include it in a response, follow-up response, which I think was dated November 10th. But we did look at reduced load configurations, and the predicted impacts from those reduced loads were less than the maximum loads that we modeled in the report.
Got it. Again, the reason I'm asking why I was looking at reduced load, if you're modeling worst-case scenario, you're running your equipment 100%, the volume, flow, and velocity going out of your stack are going to be at its maximum. If you dial that down to you're running it at half load, you may have half of the pollutant concentration, but you also have less velocity leaving the stack, and it could end up, impacting a site closer in to the facility. Does that make sense? So that's where I ended up looking at the AMAC. I mean, with those questions I raised to Jeff, I was comfortable with the methodology and the approach, the numbers. I didn't review the data input or the output files. They weren't available. And then I know Winter and Kern, Glenn, Almquist, had submitted a letter with some critique of the AMEC study. And Winter and Kern came out basically saying the national air quality standards are not the correct approach. It was McMillan and Donnelly's disagree with that. We feel that for ambient air quality analysis, that's what we have to work with. So working on that. The emissions, Winter and Kern felt the emissions inventory was not adequate. Again, we spoke to the fact that AMEC did emissions inventory using professional judgment, chose determined that the impacts from the process equipment would be sufficiently controlled through the water spray and the shroud, that they wouldn't be getting off site. there it is, shredder emissions of the larger particle and sufficiently controlled, most supportive statement. That was a statement in the Woodard and Curran letter, and I did find that they stated that it was water spray in the shroud. In addition to I also put in addition to the DEP back finding, and also there's an opacity limits for the process and fugitive emissions. So while they didn't model, that's a very difficult thing to model. Like I said, we've been doing over 20 years in the state of Maine, and out of all the projects we worked on, we've probably modeled stockpiles once and mobile sources once. And we're talking about large power plant type projects where hundreds and thousands of tons per year, so that's, you're really into that type of modeling. Notice that hand up, I was gonna get a break. Again, there's listed sources below that were typically, there were sources listed in the letter from Woodard and Curran that were not included. It was the shredder, the conveyor, the material movement, material sorting separation, road dust and storage piles. And I have a note here that the listed sources below are typically not included in minor source modeling. I've used mobile source modeling infrequently for larger projects, and that's what I just spoke to. There was a mention of not having a portable generator licensed. As long as it's not operated without a license, there's not a reason, there's nothing to stop a facility from storing a portable generator on site. You know, if they plug it in and operate it, then they're in violation. Variable load of engine, that was pointed out, and I did make the note, you know, reduced load scenarios should be assessed. Jeff has spoken to the fact that they did do that. The NO2 conversion was questioned. We find it acceptable in the 40 CFR Part 51, Appendix W and EPA guidance. That's probably doesn't mean much to you folks, but we concurred that the NO2 conversion is correct. Woodard and Curran did mention the modeling results. There were no copies of input output files made available for review. We did concur with that. We do concur that the location of maximum impacts were not identified. Typically, again, this is typically if you're doing it for a state agency or a federal agency, you're going to tell them where what your maximum impacts are, and you're going to give them the UTM locations where it occurred. So I can go point out that it's in, you know, Joe Brown's backyard, it's the highest impact, or it's wherever. Certainly.
Can you just repeat that again, what you just said about the impact?
The location?
Yeah. Because there is a nearby school to this project, where there's 500 kids.
Right. I'm going to give you the modeling 101 in about a minute and a half, as best I can. It's really difficult, I understand. Modeling is, you can't set up monitors. Monitors are very expensive to set up, very costly to run. So our best tool is to use the software, dispersion modeling. Algorithms, mathematical algorithms, each year they get, well, not each year, but every generation of model gets better and better. Moving from fact closer to, or moving from fiction closer to fact is the same. So, what we do, and what Jeff's company does, and McLean's company does when they're doing a modeling analysis, they'll set up receptors, and you could, because it's on a model, we're using topographical data, we're using meteorological data, actual meteorological data that's measured in hourly data, but we can take, and I know Jeff had receptors all the way around the fence line. I think it was on 10 or 20 meter spacing, so we can put spaced out all around, and then you usually typically put a denser grid around, close into the source, and then you put a grid out further that your spacing gets from maybe 25 meters between spacing, maybe you go 50 meters, and you stretch that out, and I believe the area covered, judging from the map, was a significant area, 65 kilometers by 65 kilometers, if memory serves. That's good coverage. 5,600 receptors that'll take a while for the computer to chew through. So we're able to do that, to be able to put receptors in a tight area and then expand out. And the reason why you expand out is you want them to find, if there's a hot spot out there, you find a hot spot, then you go and rerun the model with a denser grid near that hot spot to better identify where it happened. So if your receptor spacing is 500 meters because you're far out, and you find a hot spot, meaning high impact, you'd go back and run it with 10 or 20 meter spacing, just to hone in on that and find exactly where it is. As far as the schools, I didn't have the receptor grid at the, I guess it's the definition one would need to look to see if it was on at the school
Yeah.
properties.
There were maps provided in the report that show the receptor grid at basically 3 different magnification levels. One at the very broad 65 kilometer by 65 kilometer range, but successively getting more magnified down to the approximate location of the facility. And the receptor grid density in the vicinity of the school was quite dense. It was either 50 meters or 100 meters
I don't know,
at that location.
were you 8 by 11 and you,
Yeah, the Prairie report was 8.5 by 11.
yeah, it's tough,
Yeah, a little
but
tough to see on that. But
that's what you'd see, all those are the dots. As you see, the grid gets tighter and tighter, and then as you get around the source, it's very dense coverage around the source. Drive them out, sir.
I think we all know that this part of New England is impacted by coal burning plants in the Midwest. They're highlighting our air quality. And I know from living in the New York, New Jersey area that the DEP regulations for hydrocarbon pollution were not effectively preventing illness. Why is there no mention of catalytic converters or scrubbers on the stacks instead of just extending them up?
Well, I'm not sure that the report I received had a stack height. They didn't say whether it was extended up. And the other thing is, the best available control technology analysis that was completed for a Maine DEP air license, I did go through catalytic reduction, and I believe the controls they ended up on a cost-effective basis are fuel injection timing retard, and they have some after coolers to cool the gases down. But on an order of magnitude, what this plant will put out in a year is less than an hour in a Midwestern power plant, I promise you that.
You kind of get lost in all the details that you're giving out here, but what I'd like to know is, with these models that everyone seems to agree, you know, there's something we use in the trade to tell us whether the air is sufficiently clean, breathe, you know, people say stuff. Is there any real life correlation with coming back to the last 20 years? How close these waters are to the life? In other words, have feedback come back to you guys that the model has flaws, they're not always accurate, the points that are on your intensity points that are not correctly placed, or maybe if there's hot spots in places that, you know, things of that nature. Second, I want you to review the DEP number of gallons per location versus the 8,000 which is
Okay.
kind of lost in the process.
Yeah, then, I could do that. I feel like I'm trying to just provide a review, but I can answer both questions. First question is, each generation improves. And I know they run, I don't know if it's tests, they'll have tracer tests to see how these models run. And I think the mathematical algorithms are improved. I know what we're using now, what we used 20 years ago, light years ahead of it. You know, we can do building downwash a lot better than we used to be able to do it. I think that, you know, that's a difficult question, because that's asking, can we take what AMEC put together with 5,600 receptors? You'd have to go out and set up 5,600 data collection stations and collect that data for a year and then compare it. That's just cost prohibitive. It would never happen. I hope that's somewhat addresses it. As far as the fuel, Their fuel use is capped at 150,000 gallons per year. I believe I'm doing this from memory. It's 150 gallons per year. Their hourly is 200 gallons. So if you were to run that for 8,000 hours, someone help me with the math there, you're, yeah, it's 16, it's like 1.6 million gallons, I think, off the top of my head, around there.
That's about right.
1.7. So, yeah, 8% of it, no, 10, 10 or 11.
Why does the DEP use such an unrealistic hours per year?
The DEP doesn't have to use that. I was pointing out that that's the first slice you do. You say, what's the worst case? Well, I'm gonna run the equipment full out for a 24-hour period or for a full year. Now, if you do that and you demonstrate compliance with an annual standard, a 24-hour standard, it's not gonna get any worse. From what I understand, I mean, the model was run for 24-hour standards, running it full load for 24 hours. And I believe the DEP has a limitation of an 8 or 10-hour day. I think it's an 8-hour day, 40-hour week. So you're basically looking, the impacts that we set are so far below, we're going to be, the impacts would be actually 1/3 of that. Does that make sense? I slipped and said, I'm not on part of this project. I didn't even know about this project until 3 years ago. So when you put me in front of a group, it's all, I apologize for that.
I'm just trying to understand.
Can you stand up and tell us who you are, please?
Sorry, Christine Appleby. You ran a test already, is that what? you're
Pardon me?
saying? You already ran a test on the air quality coming from the facility?
No.
Or someone did?
No test has been run,
No test.
no. What they do is they use an emission factor. And this comes out, I believe you use an it's an EPA document that has emission factors. You can look up and say, what does a residential wood stove put out? And it can tell you, it's an estimate based on tests. You know, there's degrees of accuracy. And I believe you use the AP42 emission factor for large diesel engines. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm doing this memory, right? So that's standard practice, and I believe they'd be conservative in nature. So you would take that emission factor, it might be a pound per gallon, a pound per 1,000 gallons, and then you calculate what your pound per hour is from that.
So my question is, like, I'm really just not understanding a lot of this, so forgive me if I'm just blowing this, but, from this particular type of plant, there'll be certain types of emissions that are gonna be beyond, you know, like there's mercury, lead, you know, all kinds of stuff that I've been thinking about. So how do those get tested, so that we can feel like we're okay here?
Are you talking from the combustion source?
I'm talking about the grinder.
Yeah, I don't believe that precious metals would be emitted from that. And if they were, based on the water spray and the shroud, they wouldn't be traveling off-site.
I've got a report here, mercury contamination from metal scrap processing facilities. This is a study done by BPA in Ohio, and it
Okay.
does produce mercury. And they're concerned about them because they already have high level mercury.
Mm-hmm.
That's one. I mean, I spent a half hour when I got home from work today just looking up stuff, and that was one I found. There was another concern about, it comes from sodium acetide, acide, comes from airbags.
From the airbags.
That's just another one.
Well, that's not a hazardous air pollutant. It burns, because I burned my arm on an airbag. When it explodes, there is a acid gas release, but it's not a regulated hazardous air pollutant.
And that's not gonna rule out.
That's out of my realm. I was asked to look at a study, and that wasn't included.
And another thing I found is from California, where they were saying that from downwind from two facilities, they find morbidity and mortality rates directly related to the shredders there. So it just know what this study was showing.
I think I might defer those questions till after I finish the review, and if it's the applicant that wants to address that. Does that make sense?
But to be clear, all that you're reviewing is the diesel, the output from the diesel engine, right?
I'm reviewing the process and the methodology used from the applicant, and then what the response was from Woodard and Curran.
Right, but the analysis was on the diesel engine and.
Correct.
No other-
The
no
modeling,
other aspect of the machine.
modeling analysis was strictly on the diesel engine.
If I may, Chair Ashburn, what we would propose to do is that if these questions come up during the public comment session and we've directed to our
Right,
witness,
you
we could answer those questions at that time.
Okay, I apologize, I just really wasn't
Thank you.
understanding.
Yeah.
Good?
One more question. Hi, I'm Maureen Townsend. You mentioned the sprayer. I know you deal with air emissions, but what, the sprayer collects other particles that go into the ground? Is that where these other things are going?
And that's,
But that's not part of your review.
yeah, that's a wastewater. I'll
Okay,
defer
that
that
was
to
my
the
question,
applicant.
so you're not part of it.
Right.
No.
Does your study cover from additional truck traffic having to deal with the company?
I did mention that earlier, and again, we did a peer review, so what I do is I take a report that AMEC put together and re-review that. Basically, I review it as if my own company did it, and say, Jeff, why didn't you do it this way, or how about, and that's basically the questions I brought up today were why. But back to the emissions from truck traffic, we are in agreement that that would not be modeled. That is covered by best management practices for fugitive emission controls, for dust control within a DEP license, and they're held to an opacity standard, visible emissions. So if you've got a problem, you call the DEP, or the DEP happens to be there, and they see opacity greater than 20, I think it's 20% from the general, 20% from the general process and 20% from fugitive. I think I'm trying to do that from memory.
I think it probably proceed like this, because he's here just to give the analysis on the reports and the context of the public hearing. He wants to the applicant, may address, and Tony comes up and says something different, and we maybe we'll weigh in on some of that, but there might be a heading to know he's really enjoying it.
No place I'd rather be, Alan.
But it probably would be a bonus this time to have you on the basis.
Well, yeah, and I'm actually closing in on.
Can I ask a quick question? Is there anything you found that
Who
would
are you, sir?
I'm sorry, my name's Elliot Lasky, I live on Altamers Drive here in Berwick. Is there anything you found there that would contradict fellas' work? At the end of the day, are you saying,
The
I
AMAC?
agree with this?
Yeah, other than the couple items that I brought up that I didn't see in the report.
So otherwise you would agree with it?
Yeah.
That's pretty much what we need to know.
Well, I also agree with some of the points Woodard and Kern makes, and I disagree with some of them that they make. Which I was getting right close to, because the modeling results, we didn't see input output. I concur with that in your letter, which I believe AMEC had addressed in response to that. Location of the maximum impacts were not identified. We concur that we would typically want to see where they were. I believe AMEC has addressed that. And in the end, and I'll read this from the Woodard and Kern letter. So no attempt to provide emissions inventory for the facility operations as a whole, so it is reasonable to conclude that the modeling results do not accurately reflect facility-wide impacts will occur beyond the facility property, and then insufficient information provided in the report to conclude that operation of the facility will be in compliance with either local, state, or federal air quality standards. Our firm disagrees on this based on the use of professional judgment and the methodology followed. And the same can be said for most, if not all, similar projects. I mean, we've raised that point about everything. I mean, we've worked in a lot of power plants, right? The power plant across the river, and we could raise those questions all the time. So, and I have other comments, but they're not germane to those studies. But that's it.
So if any questions come up, like Attorney Shepherd said, we'll just direct them to you.
We're going to lose all of you.
Thank you so much.
Quite well.
Okay, questions from the board?
On both things.
And before we open it up to the public.
Um, I assume the peer review is recommended to John Engineer.
Peer review recommended through Johnson Peer,
Another question, anyone of the engineers could go to answer this. These impact values of the pollutants that are coming out of the diesel fuel, I assume that that's based upon a gallon of diesel fuel has so much pollutant. Regardless of the diesel fuel, where it comes from, how efficient it is, it's gonna give out that much pollution per gallon.
Can't hear.
Okay,
I'll repeat the question. The pollutants that are coming out of the diesel fuel, and the amount of pollutant that's coming out and measured, I would assume that a gallon of diesel fuel, regardless how it's being burned, you use a fixed amount for each of those pollutants per gallon of diesel fuel.
That's effectively correct. So to elaborate on what Tim was saying, it's common practice in our industry to use what's called emission factors. So if you take an engine of this type, and there are many engines of this type across the country, and you test a sample of those, population of those, maybe 100 engines, what you'll find is that those engines emit so many pounds of NOx for every gallon burned, so many pounds of SO2 for every gallon burned, so many pounds of carbon monoxide for every gallon burned. So those are the factors that we use, and EPA takes that data set from these multiple engines that have been tested and evaluates that, and based on that data set determines what is appropriate for them to put in their document, which is referred to as AP 42. And typically the process that EPA follows is to use a fairly conservative approach, because what they don't want to do is have emission factors that are available to the general public at large that are going to end up being used for permitting purposes, and then have an engine be placed out in the field that might actually be in excess of what those factors are. So it's in their interest to have a relatively conservative representation of what a typical engine would be, and those are the factors that we used in this particular case.
I have a question that relates to, on the same topic, how would you compare this 36,000 horsepower diesel motor that's going to be at this site to what we see, like comparing it to like locomotives that are running up and down the railroad a couple miles away? Is that comparable? And do they have to meet, the railroad have to meet the same standards that we're talking about here today?
Well, certainly it is a locomotive engine. You imagine a locomotive that's running up and down the railroad tracks, and you pull the cover off and you take that engine out of the locomotive and put it on a concrete pad. That's effectively what you have here. Locomotives have different requirements than stationary diesel engines, which now at the facility, because it's been pulled out and it's placed on a concrete pad, it is subject to the requirements of a stationary diesel engine. It's no longer subject to the requirements imposed on locomotives. Now, this is an old locomotive engine, 1967, as Tom referred to. Locomotive standards have come a long ways in the 50-some years, or 40-some years since this engine was produced. But nevertheless, even though it's a 1967 technology, and through the DEP air emission licensing process of best available control technology, even though the engine is old, it needs to meet today's emission standards, emission requirements, once it's on that concrete pad and operating.
I have a question about that then, going forward to that question. How is this actually, the DEP